Today we'll be looking at one of the most heinous crimes committed in the UK by a couple. They worked together as a serial killer and rapist duo who victimized young women and girls, including several of their daughters. Hey, it's Genevia and welcome to Mystery Digest, where every Sunday I cover true crime cases, paranormal cases, and other mystery-related content. Because of the sensitive topics discussed in this episode, here's your content warning. So how's everyone? I hope everyone ate and drank water. I hope you're not eating like right now, because this Sunday we'll be looking at the rapes and murders committed by one of the most notorious couples, Fred and Rosemary West. Fred and Rose West were a married duo of serial killers and serial rapists. So today we'll be looking into Fred's upbringing, Rose's upbringing, all the things that happened to them while they were growing up, telltale signs and behaviors before they started murdering people, and the murders and crimes that they committed together. So let's start with Fred. Fred was born in 1941. He was one of 6 siblings to his nuclear family. By a lot of accounts, he was a pretty good kid growing up. He's a bit cheeky, a bit mouthy, but still a decent kid nonetheless. Out of him and his 5 siblings, he was reportedly his mother's favorite, and not for good reason. No, not for good reason. Some who were close to the family say that Fred was being molested by his mother, that they'd play very sexual games, and as soon as Fred was able to, she initiated him. And on top of that, his father was abusive. Fred himself had told the police that his father was engaging in incest with young girls he was related to. It's unclear whether or not that included his sisters. Fred didn't do too well in school, and he dropped out to work in a farm. When he was 17, he got into a motorcycle accident where a car collided with him. He had suffered a severe head injury that left him comatose for a week. A metal plate had to be placed in his head. He then suffered another head injury when he fell from a fire escape a bit later on. Some experts have speculated that the head injuries that he received, especially the first one from the accident, may have been a contributing factor to his future behavior. I know that things aren't really going too smoothly for young Fred here, and the story isn't really getting uphill at all, but it gets worse. So much worse. It gets so much worse. Fred's behavior was erratic and disturbing. But in 1961, he was accused of getting a 13-year-old family friend pregnant. This apparently caused him to get banished from the family. Soon after, he became a construction worker, but was soon found to be stealing from his co-workers and sleeping with minors. He got charged for the 13-year-old he raped, but he escaped a really heavy sentencing because what he did was blamed on his head injury that he received a while back. However, he was convicted of child molestation. Soon after, he became involved with Rena Costello, who was pregnant already from a previous relationship, a baby girl named CHARMAINE. They got married in 1962, and a year later, they gave birth to another baby girl, Anna Marie. Their marriage was a really rocky one. They had a lot of issues that was coming up, especially because Fred worked as an ice cream van driver, which unfortunately gave him steady access to young girls. And these young girls would fall prey to his interests. Fred became acquainted with a woman named Anna McFall, and soon after they all packed up and moved to Gloucester, where Fred got a job at a slaughterhouse. Which, if you were to make a list of jobs this man should never be working with, I think slaughterhouse would be pretty up there. Fred and Rena's marriage became increasingly unstable. Rena decided that she was going to leave and she was going to take the kids with her, but Fred didn't allow her to do that. Fred let her go though, because he already planned to have Anna McFall there as someone who could keep the kids. In early 1967, Anna McFall became pregnant with Fred's child. and she was urging him to divorce Rena so they could get married. Fred didn't want to do this. So he murdered her? Yeah. He killed Anna while she was pregnant, decapitated her, cut her fingers and toes off, and buried her in a park close by. She became his first known victim and the last body to be found. 6 months after McFall's death, Fred was linked to the disappearance of a 15-year-old girl who was abducted at a bus stop early that year in January. November of the same year, he became acquainted with Rose Letts, his soon-to-be wife and lifelong accomplice. Let's take it back a few years to when Rosemary Letts was born. She was born in Devon, England, on November 29, 1953. She was the result of a very difficult pregnancy, with both her parents suffering from mental illness. Her mother was suffering from a deep depression and was given electroconvulsive therapy while she was very heavily pregnant with Rose. Her father was violently abusive and had paranoid schizophrenia. This affected Rosemary, her siblings, and her mother in a very negative way, having to survive in a dictatorship-like environment. It especially made her parents' marriage very difficult. The electroconvulsive therapy that Rose's mother went through is theorized to be a major contributing factor to Rose's slow performance in school. Rose was overweight growing up, and because she was a slow learner, it made her a perfect target for her bullies. And in retaliation, she violently attacked her bullies. So we can see that so far, Rosemary's life, it isn't a bed of roses. No pun intended. But it gets so much worse, pretty much matching the messiness of Fred's upbringing and parts of his behaviors. Rosemary was molested by her father multiple times growing up. She was said to be obsessed with her body going through puberty and became sexually active very early. Because of her figure and her father's rules, she abstained from dating boys within her age range, instead pursuing relationships with much older men from where she lived. One of them took advantage of her and raped her. Her mother grew tired of what was going on, and she decided she was going to move out and bring Rosemary with her. Surprisingly, 6 months after, Rosemary decided that she wanted to move back in with her dad, and her mother allowed her. It was around this time that she became involved with Fred, which was 12 years older than her. She was 15. And you know this man's track record with children. In spite of how her father treated her, he was totally against them dating. He went as far as to try and get social services involved, tracked down Fred's address, and threatened him in hopes of getting him to stop dating his daughter. Look, we can all agree on one thing here, and it's the fact that her father is a definition of literal trash and the embodiment of human feces. But if he can look at this and go, this ain't it, chief, you know how worse this story is about to get. That aside though, where was this social services energy when he was abusing her? Where was this social services energy when he was doing what he was doing? Don't be selective and don't be shy. Report yourself. None of Rose's father's efforts proved successful. Rose was soon pregnant with Fred's child and found herself looking after his 2 children from his previous marriage with Rena. And she was doing all of this on her own because Fred was sent to do time for various petty crimes. Rose gave birth to her child Heather in 1970. Because of her temper problems and her resentment towards raising children that aren't hers, she would treat her stepdaughters really badly. In summer 1971, it's suspected that Rose murdered 8-year-old CHARMAINE during one of her violent and erratic outbursts. Because at the time Fred was behind bars, it's believed that Rosemary buried CHARMAINE's body until Fred came back. He then relocated CHARMAINE's body, but not before removing her fingers and toes, like he did with the other victims. Fred's wife came in search of her daughter. Then she mysteriously went missing. She was strangled, dismembered, had her fingers and toes removed, and she was buried in the same general area as Anna McFall. Though Fred and Rosemary got married in January of 1972, Fred encouraged Rosemary to have sex with other men, both for money and for fun. And he would often watch through a peephole. He would also take erotic photos of her and post them in swinger magazines for ads for prostitution. In June of 1972, they had another daughter together, Mae West. And in order for them to expand and make room for their growing family and business, they moved to 25 Cornwall Street, and there's where a majority of the rapes and murders happened. Over the following years, she gave birth to 7 more kids. 3 of them belonged to Fred, another 3 belonged to her clients, and the last one is heavily suspected to be a product of incest between Rose and her father, because they were still sleeping with each other. In their apartment at 25 Cornwall Street, they had a basement in which most of the rapes, the torture, and the murders happened. They would keep the bodies there for days sometimes. They often spoke about the mummified corpses that they'd have in the house. In October 1972, Fred and Rosemary hired a young woman named Caroline Owens to work as a nanny for their children. They made multiple sexual advances to her, and she declined them all. They would also make very inappropriate jokes about the kids or things that they shouldn't be joking about. A few months after she stopped working for them, Fred and Rose drove down the street that she lived and stopped to strike a conversation with her. They asked her where she was going, and they offered to drop her right at her destination. She accepted because she didn't want to be rude. During the car ride, they were talking about, the kids and how much they're sorry that she had to leave and how much the kids really missed her and all that. And the conversation quickly turned south because Fred and Rose directed the conversation to a very sexual one. They drove her down a lonely street, beat her unconscious, then took her to their house. That's where they raped and tortured her. The next day, Fred released her without Rose knowing. She got away and pressed charges. Fred was somehow able to convince the court that what they did was consensual. So he and Rose got away with small fines of £25 for indecent assault. Over the next 6 years, they killed at least 8 young women who came in to work as lodgers or babysitters. The first was Linda Gaw, who was a seamstress the Wests knew personally. Next was Carol Ann Cooper, who disappeared while walking home from a movie theater. In December, Lucy Partington disappeared from a bus stop on her way home after Christmas. She was abducted by Fred and Rosemary, who held her captive for a week over into the new year, raped, tortured, and killed her. From 1974 to 1979, 5 more women were victimized. Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Juanita Mott, Shirley Ann Robinson, and Elisa Chambers. It's unknown if the West killed more women over the years, but it isn't unlikely. However, if they did, they didn't bury the bodies on the property. Some of the girls were known to be abducted, raped, then released. While committing the murder, Fred also sexually abused Annie Marie, his daughter from the relationship with Rena Costello. She eventually became pregnant, but the pregnancy had to be terminated because it occurred in her fallopian tube. When she left home, Fred moved his interest over to his other daughters, Heather and Mae West. The couple came close to being exposed in 1986 when Heather told her friends what she was going through while living with her parents. In June of the following year, Fred and Rosemary stopped her from school one day and strangled her to death to silence her. And her death was used as a threat towards the kids. The Wests were finally exposed in 1992 when Fred videotaped himself molesting one of his daughters, and she told one of her friends. The friend reported it to the police. The investigating officer, Hazel Savage, had heard about Fred before. When another girl came forward about being raped by Fred, the police obtained a search warrant. In August, the police searched the house for evidence of child abuse, and Fred was arrested for rape and sodomy of a minor, while Rosemary was arrested as an accomplice. While they were being processed, the younger children were placed in the care of the government. As you'd expect, they didn't say much because their parents spent years instilling fear in them. In February 1994, another warrant was obtained to search the house and the garden. The police found the remains of 2 young women that were decapitated and dismembered. West claimed sole responsibility for all the murders, and as soon as Rose heard about this, she immediately started distancing herself from her husband. Over time, Fred gave confirmation about other victims' bodies and where to find them, including the body of Rena, CHARMAINE, and Anna McFall that were all buried away from the house. As the case developed, Rose tried increasingly to distance herself from her husband, trying to push the narrative that she was a victim. But the police weren't convinced because of her involvement in the rapes and the sheer number of murders that have occurred. Fred was devastated when he found out that Rose was separating herself from him and denying everything. On December 13, 1994, Fred was charged on 12 counts of murder. He hung himself in his cell while awaiting trial. Rose went to trial on October 3, 1995, and on November 22nd of the same year, she was sentenced to life behind bars without the possibility of parole. Rose launched 2 appeals in 1996 and the year 2000. The first appeal was rejected and she dropped the second one. The West's home, or the House of Horrors as it was dubbed by the media, was grazed down in October 1996, and in its place is a pathway that leads to the town center. So that one was mighty heavy. So what do you guys think about the whole case, like as a whole? What do you guys think about their upbringing? What are the factors that really could have pushed both Fred and Rose to do what they did, if you believe that those factors even count? And do you think Fred committing suicide before his trial was even justice at all? Thanks for sticking around to the end of this episode. Please remember, don't murder people. No, don't murder, because it's just don't do it.